Well, I thought I would just start by flinging out a naive question as the outlying person here with not most of the no knowledge. But we've seen some really interesting computer-aided design tools coming along that can well, partly can just help people do things more easily, so that they require fewer steps, but also could take over the creation process, like AI that can actually create. And I found myself wondering where that's going to lead us, and whether human architects are going to become unnecessary, and we're just going to leave it up to AIs in the future, or have humans got something special that they can contribute that we don't really know how to mimic artificially yet? I was wondering what people think about that. Will you be out of a job?
Yes. I find this super interesting in the sense that maybe 10 years ago I would say, oh, architecture is going to be one of the last frontiers for AI. So I'm not quite sure anymore.
I thought that about neuroscience.
So yeah. So Stefan, what do you think?
This is actually, obviously, it's a very good question. It's something that I debated with my friends in the past, and then I also agreed, no, it's going to be the last frontier. But after seeing the presentation about the AI that's painting with only 20 strokes, it kind of baffled me, and I don't have an answer. But I tend to say that I'm not worried, even though I'm quite young. I don't think AI will take our job in my lifetime. So, but in the same time, all this kind of new wave of technology and techniques that are getting involved into architecture and the planning of the built environment, instead of taking our jobs, they can actually better the way in which we do architecture. And then today was a great example of was a great example of people that are showing different kind of options in which technology can improve the way in which we do architecture in the built environment. And yeah, it's not an answer, but it's just how I see things.
Zuha, do you have any observations on this with your Parasim proposition?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Basically, for the AI, it's maybe outside of my presentation, but I had many people saying that the artificial intelligence or the new technology can take over the architectural role. Maybe in somehow they are correct, because maybe we're gonna lose our traditional way of design, of thinking about the architecture. If we don't change our process nowadays, we will be out of the game later on. So I don't think so that we will not need architects in the future, but we need a new architecture design methods and new architecture design process. So we still need architects in somehow. And if I go back to my presentation or my let's say research, my presentation is basically from my PhD, which is about the architecture education. It's now we have a huge gap between the practice and architecture education. We still have very traditional way of teaching students and educating student architecture design. It's a good way of teaching them how to design, but still this is a huge gap between the practice in terms of digital technologies and the architecture education. And within the fast and let's say rapid technological development, I think this gap can be more and more within the future. So I'm thinking about how to reduce this gap, how to introduce a student to these new technologies. It's still very, very big problem, because the student graduated with a good architectural, good understanding about how to design, but I don't know how they are good in terms of using this technology to support their design decision making and use of this potential of the technologies.
It's interesting that you say that, because I would have said it was the other way around, that the young people coming along are probably very quick to adapt to these new things, and it's the old established people that are stuck in their ways.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, because there is a term of the digital native and digital immigrant, because somehow we are represent the digital immigrants, the new students, they are digital natives, but still they use these technology based on their self-education, not by the university or the School of Architecture methods or very accurate way. So we don't know if they are following the right process or they're using this, because from my point of view, many of the students use these technologies just for representation and speed drawings, not to use these potential impact or potential use for this software to support their design decision making, to use the BIM, to use artificial intelligence, all of these other fantastic things are going on in these technologies. The student focusing on only representation and this fancy shape or this kind of form finding.
Right. So something I was struck by in several of the talks is, so I've always thought of architecture as a more of a sort of an artistic endeavor than an engineering one. So less quantitative and more creative, more intuitive, I guess. That's my stereotype that I have. It's probably horribly wrong. But it was interesting to see, and I know that architecture is very quantitative when it comes to the more mechanical and engineering side of things, but it's interesting to see now some quantitative approaches to human behavior in spaces. So several of the talks actually measured aspects of people's responses. And I wondered if that's something new for architecture and whether that's going to increase in the future, and whether more cognitive neuroscience and more cognitive psychology techniques are going to get pulled into architecture in the future. Do people think that's the way forward, or a way forward?
Could I have a go at your earlier question? I was just wondering, just to introduce myself, I'm Leo Garber. I'm the coordinator of the Construction Blockchain Consortium with ABLE. My background is not in the technical field, but it is in kind of politics and social policy. I've studied that. But so just from that kind of sociological, perhaps psychological background, I think that, you know, artificial intelligence may take some jobs, you know, and it could take many jobs. But I think that the question is how much humans and politicians and so on want to permit that, especially, I think, given that for two reasons really. One is that I think people enjoy having purpose. They like to either work or to have a vocation. So I think that, you know, they may not want to let robots take over. Obviously, there might be an economic necessity that might be forced over by politicians, but that's something else to consider. And the other thing is the value of workplaces and people's natural inclination to interact and to be social. I think that those could be two things that become a partial roadblock, I think, in architecture and AEC generally to further automation.
Why would that be a roadblock?
Because if people want to hold on to those things and people want to stay in employment and to work regularly and to have a vocation, there will be, I think, significant pressure to resist complete automation of many processes.
That's not how history works, though, is it? I mean, I'm sure the coal miners of old would have said, yeah, we don't want mechanized means of extracting coal because we like to have jobs. But
absolutely, I mean that there is certainly a class dynamic to that, and I think that has yet to be seen. And technology, I think, can go both ways. It can facilitate relationships and social progress, and in other ways, it can facilitate economic progress. And sometimes those two can align, and other times they don't. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I also think I agree and I disagree. In the sense that in architecture or in product design, I think there is this feeling that when you acquire an artifact, is almost like someone giving you a gift, and this is like maybe it's an illusion because things can be mass produced and it's completely detached from one human being giving a gift to another human being. It's not that every chair was a design chair especially for you. But we have that feeling, and I wonder if this is like a trap or is actually an opportunity. I'm not quite sure, because we can imagine a world that people say, okay, machines can do everything, and we can have machine learning, and we can have artificial intelligence automating everything. But I prefer that human connection through objects I have. But then again, you can put this idea upside down and say, wouldn't the machine be the ideal creator or selector of the best gift you can give to someone? And then it becomes very ambiguous and blurry. So I'm curious about it. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen, but I'm very curious about it.
Yeah, it's an exciting time to be alive, the information revolution.
Yes. So okay, your second question, maybe we should go back to the second question you made.
I can't remember what it is now.
Yes.
I've thrown us off topic.
What was it I said?
It's about learning. No.
Oh yeah. Whether cognitive science, or whether methods and architecture are at one edge approaching towards cognitive psychology in terms of interests and methods, and whether there's a dialogue to be had between those disciplines.
I suspect there is. The more we can see, the finer the nuance it is when we of measuring space when we are designing. I think we have that tendency to kind of use the measurements we have to try to engineer space. So I think we will see something like that. But that's again, I suspect. Stefan, maybe. Because you've been playing with
yes,
augmented
exactly.
reality.
I'm 100% sure this will happen if it's not happening already. Because if you think about architecture, it started for the need of shelter. So we started building things because we wanted to shelter ourselves from the nature, and then this kind of transcends into making beautiful things, not only for it. So it was the need of shelter, the need of beauty, and building beautifully. And then later in our history, it becomes something related to the function. So we wanted to be beautiful, but also something super functional. But I think now we are at the verge of the next wave, which could be also how do we feel in the space, especially under the current circumstances when suddenly half of the population spend 80% of their time in the past year or in the past half year indoors. And then I think this is much more present in the mind of the users than ever. Like, how do we actually feel in the space? How do we feel? So I think this is it's about to happen, or if it's not happening now. That's why my paper put the user at the center. And then I was thinking like, oh, maybe but when you dislocate somebody who lived in a completely different environment and put it in rural Switzerland, it's Switzerland, it's really beautiful, but it's still a rural environment. Are they gonna adapt to it? So I was kind of imagining this kind of utopian where everybody will use this kind of headset in order for them to accommodate gradually. So yeah, I think this field will definitely be a part in the decision making when you design a building.
Yeah, because I could see lots of ways in which cognitive psychology could contribute. So we've got very sophisticated analytic methods now for measuring behavior and controlling for confounds, like multiple confounds that have been discovered over the years. Like if you repeatedly test people, or if you prime people with certain mindset, you can influence their responding and stuff like that. And ways of measuring physiological parameters. So you mentioned EEG. There's always problems with scalp electrodes because you're also picking up muscle action, but there's ways of kind of getting around that. And yeah, a whole enormous range of techniques. And I think the question of trying to find out how do people feel in particular spaces is a really interesting one. And how do you design a space that people are going to feel good in? Or maybe you don't want them to feel completely good. Maybe you want them to also feel slightly nervous.
In my paper, I was trying to assess if they feel comfortable, and then by comfortable, I was translating that into, because comfortable is a very vague term, and I was translating that into how much information do you have, and then I kind of made that comparison with you don't feel comfortable in darkness, and people do not feel comfortable in darkness in general because they don't have enough information about their environment. So, as an antithetic example, if you have a lot of information, do you feel comfortable, or are you overwhelmed with the amount of information that you are receiving, so you don't feel comfortable? So that was the paradigm that I was trying to tackle with, I'm one of them within my paper.
So have you thought about measuring just simply measuring people's behavior? Like, for example, saying to people, now that you've explored the space, go back to the place where you felt most relaxed.
That's the problem with my test. I thought about it, but the main problem with the experiment that I've made is that it wasn't a fully immersive environment. It was done through a 2D screen, basically. So I think the next step will be to reproduce the experiment using a HoloLens or a fully immersive environment. So that's why I couldn't ask them, but obviously I thought about it. So because of this kind of technical impediment, I couldn't carry for the research further, but I definitely will probably do that in the future with a fully immersive device.
That'd be really cool. Yeah.
Okay. I also thought Patrick's presentation was quite interesting in the sense that we can, sometimes we design something with a particular intention or vision, and people react differently. But then when we ask them, or we give them hope to believe that what they are seeing is what we believe to have designed, then we just shift the direction of the appreciation of the space to an extent. I think this is quite interesting. So how far can we go with designing bespoke spaces that actually can attain that emotional load or the emotional blueprint we expect them to have? I don't know if there is any detailed research in this area, but I find this also quite interesting. Architects are often blamed for kind of designing things with a particular intention, and then things go terribly wrong, and people do not use or see the space the way we expect them to see. So I don't know how we can. It seems like now we can potentially start to quantify things like this with VR, etc. So how do you see all this?
Who are you asking?
All of us, yeah.
Okay, yeah, has anyone got?
Yeah. So do you think we imagine things and design things with a particular intention, and that intention gets lost once it becomes reality? Or is there a residue there that is worthwhile? I'm not quite sure how far we developed this type of investigation. I don't know, Kate, if you came across anything. So
no, but I've not looked a lot. But I suppose the question for designers is: do you imagine what will work well, and then build it and hope that it does, or do you try and test out elements of it on people to see if it, like, is there any experimental component to the design?
No, I think architects have this very strange behavior. We dream a lot, and we spend a period of the time of the project being kind of wishful thinkers. We think that what we are designing is going to have a real impact and effect on people. And sometimes it does, as just maybe magic. I don't know what it is. Some designers can do it, but sometimes it's just a fiasco. And it would be good to rationalize this process. So people say that there are lots of urban myths about, you go to this particular coffee shop in Oxford and you ought to have a great idea. And I don't know how real all of this is, but apparently some architects, they seem to have this esoteric power to design a place, and the things that they plan to happen in this place seem to happen almost like they can stage human activity, and sometimes it doesn't work. I don't know if this is something that happens after the fact. So you design a little bit like a very good marketing campaign, like with a champagne, for example, Dom Perignon, paying celebrities in Paris to drink his wine in front of the people, and then Dom Perignon becomes the a very good champagne. I don't know if some architects operate in this particular way, and it becomes reality. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because they work on it after the fact, or if it's something that actually can be engineered in a level that we can actually predict that this will help a space to operate in a particular way.
Something that worries me about the intuitive architects approach is that like architects are not necessarily representative of the general population because they've been highly selected for particular attributes that may not be the things that everyone has. So we ran into this when we were trying to redesign the space that I work in, and the architects were really keen on making it all open plan, and the academics all wanted little tiny mouse holes where they could hide away and think academic thoughts. This is completely opposite. And I sort of thought, I could see that architects probably, they're creative and they're sociable and they're kind of free thinking, this again is my stereotype. But the average doctor, if you're designing a hospital, or the average teacher, like humans differ in how they process space and spaces. So there is a lot of scope, I think, for more quantitative exploration of what works and what doesn't for different types of people.
I was about to say almost the same thing before you added this. So it's more about how you feel inside the space and not about the function. And to be honest, I think if you as an architect think about the space and design it, and then the user likes it, but the user uses the space in a different way that you predicted, that's still a successful space because the user feels good or feels accordingly to what he has to do in that space. So he's using the space. It doesn't matter how he uses the space, but if he still uses the space, I think it's still a successful architectural gesture. If he goes there because he is the only space in which the user can go, and then he doesn't feel fine, and then he has to invent a new way of using the space, then it's not a successful architectural story. But if the user still uses the space and enjoys using the space, no matter in which way the user uses, either how you predict it as an architect or in a different way, I still think it's a successful story.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that. But there's like things like architect just not design the building, but let the user the design. Like architect just define like the boundaries, like the generic shape or something like that. But then let the user use it and decide to design it. I think that's the more interesting than like architect define everything and user use it.
I wouldn't say allow the user to design it. I would just say allow the user to bring its input into the design process.
Yeah.
That often does result in further design, doesn't it? The user says, you've got to move this thing, it's not working.
Yeah.
So
yes, there's often this appropriation process where the users simply transform for the despair of the architect, they just transform the space.
No, that's supposed to be the special. Yeah, this was supposed to be reading.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a question here actually for Stefan from our audience. Do you think you lose information as well as gain it through the AR lens in your example? The initial more abstract model compares the massing between the buildings quite well, which the extra information could obscure. What is your opinion on this?
So at the beginning, my test was trying to see if through AR and through an influx of cognitive information, you could have an effect over the user. And I think I kind of proved that it does have an effect. And then I said like, okay, now because we kind of know that AR has an effect over the user, how can we use that? And then I thought like, oh, maybe instead of adding information, you can cover information and reveal it through AR in time. So yeah, that's what I was trying to say. The initial more abstract model compares the massing between the building quite well, which the extra information could obscure. Yeah, so it didn't obscure anything. It was just the possibility of obscuring if everybody will have this kind of headset on. So it was just an utopical idea. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, yeah, there is, I believe, a question for me from Ran Xiao. Yeah, there is a temporal element to it as well. There is like a space-time relationship, very strong relationship when we think about architectural program. So you say here that laboratory results may not persist in the real world as attitudes and needs change. This is absolutely true, but I think there is a layering as well. There is a kind of a fundamental cognitive layering. I think there are like, I believe, fundamental pillars on how we appreciate space and use space. And there is the more transitional, fashionable or fashions that come and go on how a space is used. But it would be great to have a kind of a unifying framework for all of this. So there are, I believe, another question from an anonymous attendee saying, to Abel, how do you justify the role of art and culture played as part of our living environment? I think it's fundamental. It's really fundamental. I think it brings a emotional nexus to the built environment, and it also plays with our memory and how we navigate. I think the best person to discuss this is actually Kate. So placing art in the built environment.
Yes, I mean, I think art, I mean, is this buildings as art or art in buildings? I think buildings as art, which is kind of what I think of what architecture does.
Yes, the question doesn't, so it's just say, how do you justify the role of art and culture played as part?
I think it's tremendously important. Speaking as a naive just person who likes things to be beautiful, you know, I think that how spaces make you feel is really critical to designing them. Like, it's not just a shelter.
Yes.
And so, but the question is, how do you meet the conflicts that sometimes arise between the functional needs of the building and the need for it to be beautiful? For example, if something's open plan, it looks much nicer, but it's much harder to work in, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, I mean, ideally we want these things to come together. We want kind of utility and aesthetics to somehow be brought together. And that's where I think cognitive science can help, because I think once we have a better handle on what types of things make people feel better or less good in what conditions, and for what kind of people, and maybe we can use AI to get at that as well. We can then start to design things that are always maximally beautiful and functional. But it feels like a moving target, because what's beautiful feels like it shifts rapidly. So I was musing on this question of AI, you know, for example, painting paintings. I'm thinking in the past, when we've had technology that has taken over our art for us, we've kind of lost interest in that type of art often. So, for example, if you get a laser cut ornament, you don't, you know, that's extremely intricate and beautiful, you would probably now look at it and think this is kind of naff. Whereas if you found a, you know, 500-year-old intricately carved ornament that had been made by hand, you'd go, this is just stunningly beautiful. So our conceptions of beauty are constantly changing. And I think that's a real challenge, especially for architects, because buildings have to last for a long time.
Yes, yes.
To if I could add, extending my earlier point, I mean, if automation does, take our jobs, then not to be too much of an optimist, but if they, if we have universal basic income and so on, things like arts and culture generally will become very important. You could see a lot of people formerly, working in other jobs, moving into that sector out of their own personal well-being. Unless, of course, machines do take over the arts as well, but hopefully.
Yeah, so we'll become pets.
Yeah, basically.
Okay, my cat has a good one.
Okay, Kate, I would like to, I'm noting the time, and I would like to thank you very much for taking the time to be here and host the session. I thought it was worthwhile, was incredibly interesting. Just to finalize the official day, so to speak, there's a second session concludes the first day of the conference. Tomorrow we'll be online again from 10 o'clock in the morning. We'll have Professor Chris Speed from University of Edinburgh. He has a research group there dealing with design informatics. I met Professor Speed at in an event in Cambridge a few months ago. And he has some very interesting take on design information, and I hope he's talking about something I find super interesting, which is blockchain and how blockchain has an impact in design. Blockchain is one of the emerging technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, and is quite fundamental and disruptive. And after his keynote, we'll then proceed with the design culture session. And after that, in the afternoon, we will have the posters. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'll join this other call now, and see you all in this other call, and also tomorrow morning. Yeah.
Thank you very much. See you on the other.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.